Welcome to the Gourds and Pomegranates podcast, talking common sense for church communications. Here's Hannah and Joe.
So obviously a lot of time we think really practically about communications. It's kind of the nature of the podcast. That's what we set out to do. But today we're going to think just a little bit wider about the whole experience of church, like every aspect from when someone arrives and is welcomed to when they leave, and looking at things through the eyes of this newcomer.
Yeah. I know we had a really kind of profound experience when we moved back to Dorset 2 and a bit years ago. So I had to find a new church, and I really didn't want to be a part of my parents' church because it was my parents' church. And so I said, right, I'm going to go and visit all the local churches in my town and just see what they're like. I'm not going to just assume one and settle there. And it was a really, I say weird experience because it, I don't want to say out of body either, but it was just a weird experience because the first one I tried, I'd never been in it before. And as I walked up the steps, I had that kind of nervous feeling in my stomach. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm really nervous. Like, but why? Like, I've been going to church my whole life. It's not as if I've only been in one. I've been to lots of different churches. And I've just finished a job where I was going to like 10 different churches a week. So the process of stepping into a church was nothing new to me. Yeah. Yet for some reason I was really nervous. And I think because it wasn't work, it was I'm going to have my spiritual feeding time.
Yeah, it was a personal thing.
Yeah. And I was like, gosh, if this is, I wouldn't say terrifying for me. If this is like making me anxious, how terrifying must it be for someone who's going to church for the absolute first time, especially because there were so many people saying, you know, because of the pandemic, a lot of people had come to faith online. And so now we were starting to come to the buildings. And if you're stepping into the building for the first time, like it was I just thought, gosh, that must be, I don't know, it's enough to put you off going kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. So we want to try and think about this whole process, and it might be that this applies to someone who has been to church loads. It might be that it's someone who's their very first time, but just thinking about it through their eyes. And hopefully there are some helpful questions that we can ask that come out of what we share today. You know, I think as much as anything else, actually, if your takeaway from this is to think of some other questions that you can ask for your church. You know, it's something when we spoke to Laura a while back, she talked about the importance of getting someone's feedback when they're new and when they're just settling in because they've got that fresh perspective. Yeah. So that's really helpful. And there used to be, I think it's still going, not quite as active, but there's a website called Mystery Worshipper. We'll put a link in the show notes where people would go in and just anonymously kind of review churches. So we're asking, in a sense, how can we do this for ourselves? And that can be quite a hard exercise when you're doing it yourself because you aren't going to be objective. You're too close to it. But actually, I still think that there are things that we share that can be helpful to do yourselves. But you don't have to limit it there. You know, off the back of what we share today, it might be an opportunity to invite friends along and people who aren't familiar with the church. And they'll get that fresh perspective, as we spoke about with Laura, asking what it's like for them and what things stick out as things that you could potentially improve. So that's the idea today. And we're going to go through that step by step, starting with the very first step, which is before they've even made it through the door.
Yeah. So how are they first encountering you? You need to think about it from lots of different perspectives, but the potential different perspectives and opportunities that may be out there. So that might be through your website, through social media, from signage. You know, they're fairly kind of obvious things that we do to communicate, but actually what is it like from that other side? It sounds really harsh to say, but are they any good? Actually, you might think that they're quite nice because it's what we've been doing always, but actually, is it a bit outdated now, that the design style or
the content?
That's a big one to think about, because if you've got something that's talking about the pandemic, you know, we're now back open. Yeah, but you've been open for the last 2 years because
I still see it on lots of church homepages.
Yeah, or the thing that really annoys me is like Christmas 21, Easter 22, Christmas 22. And now we're like, well, we've had Christmas 23. You need to make sure you're updating things because actually, even though it sounds really harsh to say, but if you're not a part of the church, if that's the thing that you're seeing is about out of date content, actually people are just going to think that you're out of date, and that
and
actually
it sends a message.
Oh, it just sends like a messy message.
Yeah.
And just people think, oh, well, they're not actually talking about anything that's relevant or up to date because they're not up to date.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think thinking visually as well, it's not just about how good things look, but trying to have that consistency of quality and of style as well.
Yeah.
And so that it's something that if someone sees your website, that when they actually do make that step and come to see you, that there's some consistency there, that they're, even if they're not connecting it, that there's a feeling of consistency there.
Yeah.
But then, I don't think we need to labor too much on these things because these are the things we talk about every episode, right?
Yeah.
But thinking wider about how the grounds look, for example, if you've got a car park that's got loads of rubbish in it or it's completely overgrown, then okay, it's not the biggest thing. No one's arguing it's the most important thing, but it does send a message when people come in, and just having that somewhere on your radar of having that tidier space and making it a bit more inviting.
Yeah.
Because we're then moving on from that to think about when people do actually cross the threshold.
Mm.
And a helpful question is to think about what people see as they walk through the door for the first time, or even across the car park, like we've mentioned with the grounds. And it might be helpful to actually go and do this physically, like go and stand at the door of the church or go and stand and look from the gate across the car park and make a note of what people are seeing at this point. Because the physical act of actually going and doing this can help to open our own eyes to the things that we don't see, because we just walk past them each week. We're so familiar with them that our eyes don't even notice anymore.
Yeah.
So, for example, it might be that there's no signage because we know where the toilets are when we come in, but people who haven't been before don't. And that might be something that they're concerned about when they come in. It might be that there's loads and loads of notice boards, and that's the thing that people are confronted with. And it just doesn't need to be there. Not saying that it's not important to have notices, but it doesn't need to be the first thing that people are greeted by when they come in.
No. I mean, the thing as well of like the first things and stepping over the threshold that I think it's a weird thing for churches is that for some churches, they're these big buildings with big wooden doors that for those who attend church, it's quite a welcoming sight. But for people who don't go to church and don't have a positive association with it necessarily, big wooden doors where you can't see in, it gives a kind of more imposing view.
Yeah.
And like if you've always got the doors shut because, it's cold and windy, well, yeah, but actually that's not very inviting to sort of make people come in, or they think, they're shut, so I'm not going to try. Yeah. Whereas having, I don't know, it's all dependent on the church, but I think that it is really
it's having
important.
the conversation, isn't it? Because it might be that it's essential to have those doors closed for the heating, or it might be that by having another door closed inside that you can get around that. And actually, you just need to prioritize. We come back to it again and again with all sorts of comms issues of prioritization. But if you're having the discussion and thinking of it, then you're already, in the right direction.
Yeah. I mean, and of course you can have like stewards and welcomers on the door, and then they can point to stuff. But as you said with signage, it's very easy for things to get missed. All those big questions we asked of like, where's the toilets? Or actually accessibility, that how do I get in if I've got a wheelchair, or, if hearing's an issue. So where do I need to sit to get the loop and stuff like that, of things that are really important to get asked. But if you don't have someone who's aware of those things, or there's no one to point you if the question gets asked, and people can just kind of feel left out.
And that question can just be, is there anything you need or you're not sure about?
Yeah.
You're not always going to be able to notice everything, and you probably shouldn't try to. But if you can at least ask that question and give people the opportunity, then again, there are some things which are a bit more obvious. So when we turned up to new churches with a 6-month-old, it was quite nice when people said, oh, by the way, there's a creche, it's out there, it's after the second song. Rather than kind of awkwardly hovering and saying, is there a creche? Like immediately it puts you on the back foot as the visitor. And if there isn't one, then you kind of feel bad for asking, or they feel bad in answering, and all that sort of thing.
Yeah. And I suppose that stuff you can kind of, in a way, have a list prepared beforehand of just going, these are the things that we as the welcoming team need to be thinking about. But also these are ways to ask it, rather than going, do you have any needs that you want us to sort? But of just going, do you need it, or if there's anything that you want pointing to, directing to, I'm here to help. That's then how you sort of have that welcoming relationship with someone, rather than just sort of expecting everyone to either have the confidence to ask or to assume that they know where everything is because, well, why wouldn't you know where the toilets are?
Yeah, exactly. And again, with that prioritization, foyers tend to be overwhelming. There's lots of information, there's lots of people, there's often lots of noise. So just prioritizing that information, thinking, do we need to have 5 posters up there, or actually would one be better? The same goes for, the slides before the service, that if you've got 15 slides going around on a loop, actually, would you be better off having 3 or 4? And then people can get the information that you want to get to them then, and just try and avoid that overwhelm for people. Yeah, it's never an easy thing, but hopefully it's something that's helpful. And it is going to be different for every church. We can't give hard and fast answers here. But again, just thinking objectively about your building, the way that it works, the different entry points and how they're laid out can be really helpful way of making things easier for people when they visit your church.
Yeah. So then if we think about signposting, which is, again, a really important part of it, because it's not just physical, but it's about making things easier for people so they're not having to kind of guess what's coming next, and it can be quite an alienating experience when you sort of are very unsure, and because you can't expect what's going to happen next, because this is new to you, whether you're new to church or it's a different style of church, or like you said about, you don't know when the creche was open, or when things were happening that you could move around with a child or something. And so if the service is starting in 5 minutes, actually you need to make that clear to people, make sure that it is signposted, and you can have things like a countdown, and actually that can be quite fun. People sort of feel like a bit of a kind of, I've got to rush around and say hello to people, or actually I've got 5 minutes, I'm just going to settle myself. And so that when your service starts, that actually people are ready for it to start, and you're not then going, all right guys, come on now, settle down. But also actually when your service finishes, don't just sort of, all right, we finished the song and we're just going to wander off. But again, could you have some slides to say, thanks for joining, here's tea and coffee? Because that was actually something that I had at one church, is they were like, cool, tea and coffee's happening now. And I was like, where? There's no cafe in this building. And I genuinely didn't know where to go.
And for some churches, that will be obvious because it will be in the same room. But you know your context, and it's just asking those questions. Yeah. And I think another thing, staying with the step-by-step, the first thing that people do after go through the foyer is go into the hall or the sanctuary or the whatever you want to call it. But even in small churches, it can be quite hard to find somewhere to sit.
Yeah.
Especially if people have got bags out, or you might feel that people have got their reserved seats or something like that. And what is really helpful then is to just have people who are looking out for people who need help.
Yeah.
And I get it. Small churches probably can't have a dedicated person or steward or welcomer who's kind of at the front of the church looking back for empty seats, looking for people to be passed off from the welcomers to them. But at the very least, your welcomers can kind of try and keep half an eye on that and just be aware. It might involve moving some regulars up a seat so that there's space for people, all that sort of thing. Because it's a simple thing. And a lot of these things are really simple when you think about it. But it just helps to remove all of these little barriers that can make people feel uncomfortable, especially when they might already be pushing themselves out of their comfort zone as they're visiting you for the first time.
Yeah. So thinking through some other areas, atmosphere is quite an important one. And it might sound quite sort of fluffy and kind of irrelevant, but actually the atmosphere of your building, of sort of whether that's main hall or if you have a space first, it can really make a difference to how people feel and how they come into the service.
Yeah.
Even when it's done for the sake of kind of reverence and just solemnity into the service, having it absolutely silent really can feel quite uncomfortable.
Yeah, like you're not allowed to talk.
No. And it sort of brings back the kind of rule.
Feels like a school assembly.
Yeah, shh, we got to be quiet, otherwise we're going to get told off or something. But on the other hand, equally, that if everyone's talking and there's loud discussion and just does become quite a sort of cacophony of noises, actually it can be quite then isolating if you don't know anyone and you're sort of just sat there quietly to yourself. But with the latter case, it's, often a reminder of the importance of having a culture of warmth and welcoming, so that everyone in the church, of whether you're on welcoming teams or hospitality or whatever, just that everyone is on the lookout, I suppose, for those who are new or that maybe are a bit on their own, but just actually that we sort of have this nature of going, hi, are you new? Well, how are you? And just sort of so that everyone is spoken to.
Yeah, that doesn't have to be a scary thing. Like it could just be saying hello. But I think the thing with that is it won't just happen. That does take developing a culture, that does take time, but it's a really important thing. It's part of who we are as believers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then kind of feeding into the atmosphere is a really quick win, where if you just have some music playing before the service, it doesn't have to be crazy loud. It doesn't matter too much whether it's from live musicians or a playlist, but it allows conversations to happen without, having to have it too loud and then people can't hear each other, so they're shouting. It can just help set the tone. And what it might also do is give an opportunity to introduce new songs.
Yeah.
Perhaps, songs that you're going to sing in the service and learn, or maybe songs that actually the church isn't quite ready for that style of music, but you're just bringing in this different music, which might just be helpful for sort of thoughtful reflection before the service starts.
Yeah.
And then another benefit of having this background music is that when it finishes, and hopefully by finishing, that's a nice gentle fade rather than instant cutout, as happens too often. But when it does finish, it gives quite a clear signal that the service is starting, and it helps to avoid that awkwardness where the service leader is just like trying to talk over the mic, trying to shout over people and trying to like stop discussions which aren't really stopping.
So it's not just school assemblies now, this is school classrooms.
Yeah, literally.
So the next thing is language, which we've talked about with what you're writing online, either in your website and stuff. But given that so much of a service is delivered verbally, it's really important and helpful to consider actually how we talk. So again, thinking not from someone like myself who is a Christian and I know what you talk about when you're saying certain liturgical grammar, even liturgy. But, it's just being mindful of your Christianese, that actually, if there's new people, and especially actually if they're sort of not native English speakers, where perhaps certain words are not so obvious for them. And, it can be easy for us to be slightly blind to what effectively is an alien language to a lot of people, and certain behaviors that we do at church that are so natural to us, but to others might be like, oh, actually, I'm not sure how I do this thing. And that isn't to say that we shouldn't be dumbing down what we're saying, but it's just bearing in mind. So whether that is putting things out or just sort of you say it and maybe then give an explanation that doesn't need to take a lot of effort, but it's sort of just thinking actually how can we provide resources for people that might just need a bit of an introduction to certain terminology.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean, as you've said, dumbing things down. It's not about simplifying your message, but it's just about simplifying the way that you say things. Because even as someone who's been to church all my life, if I'm going into a different denomination, then I can still feel alienated by that.
Yeah.
But again, it's just having these things in mind will help us that awareness will help us to actually do something about it and just bear these other people's needs before our own.
Yeah. And actually one thing that I have thought about recently, totally unrelated, but I've given up drinking, which is like a personal decision I just wanted to kind of make for my health. But communion has been a really weird one in the sense of I say no to drinks at dinner or drinks at a bar or something. But if wine is served with communion, I'm like, yeah, that's fine. But actually, we need to factor in that perhaps people have addictions that they're trying to sort of work through and stuff. And that maybe an assumption of, well, if someone's not coming up for communion or people feel obligated to come up, but actually that's something that's a real struggle for them. But of just being able to kind of have things for people where they can be like, look, don't feel pressured to do this, or actually, children are welcome to come up for this. Because again, different denominations will do things differently. But that was something else I thought recently about actually, are we aware of what we're doing and how different people's circumstances actually might make a difference in how they're responding to it?
Yeah, and just, thinking about other people's situations means that we're less likely, hopefully, to have those blind spots. And communion is definitely a big one of them, because how we do it is different in every church.
Yeah.
And just listing it out to people as we go and explaining that you hold on to you eat the bread straight away, but you hold on to the wine, or you do the other. And, it's not important how, as long as you're communicating it to people and making it clear.
Yeah.
So changing tack slightly and not to be too controversial, too negative here, but thinking about quality and just don't be a penny pincher is what I want to get at, I suppose. And we completely understand that, especially in small churches, but in all churches, budgets are tight, despite what people often think. But sometimes spending just a little bit extra in certain areas can actually be beneficial. So we've probably, between this podcast, every other church podcast, or every other Christian conversation, too much has been said about coffee in church. But having the cheapest brand of instant coffee can, unfortunately, like it or not, send a bit of a signal to people that you don't really want them hanging around and feeling comfortable, and you'd rather that they brought a Costa with them or something. We mentioned this when we were talking to Ben Elliott, and the idea that even a brand of soap that we use in the bathroom has the opportunity, at least, to communicate a positive or negative message to people about how much we care about them, how much we value them being with us and enjoying the experience. And it's not the be all and end all. We're certainly not called to spoil people, and we're not called to spend loads of money just to impress people. But it does bear thinking about that sometimes these little things go a long way. Yeah. And the same goes for how we think about quality in other areas of church as well. So the style of music in our song worship, how our PA sounds, going back to the comms side of things, the visual design of our publicity, again, this isn't about putting on a performance. We're not trying to have a West End production here, but we should be seeking for excellence. Going back to the title of this podcast, we want to give God the best we can. We want to honor him. And it frustrates me slightly because it's often put out there that if things are too professional, then it's going to distract people away from the reason they're really there, and it's going to be unhelpful because they're not going to be worshiping. But in my experience, we are often closer to the other end of the spectrum, where a lack of attention to detail and to quality makes things distracting, but for the complete different reason.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm sure there's lots of things that we could touch on, and we'd love to hear from you with your ideas. So do feel free to email us at hello@gppodcast.uk. But lastly, for now at least, don't let your connection with someone end as soon as they walk out the door. Sure, we could go into talking about contact cards to get people's information, or even, have a card to give details so that people don't feel so terrified of giving their information, but actually you're giving the church's information, which could be key people or ministries in the church that might be useful. Or we could do gift bags and encouraging people to stay in touch. But, on the simplest level, it's just about connecting with people, ask questions, find out more about them. And if there's a bit of a rapport there, maybe even suggest meeting for a coffee outside of a Sunday. That could be kind of a really lovely way to make them feel like they were welcome into the church, and even connect with them personally on social media.
Yeah, who knows, you might even benefit yourself from it rather than it all just being about the visitor. Yeah. I think, to sum up, ultimately, as much as we spend a lot of time talking about church comms, and we're mainly thinking about it from an organization point of view of the church communicating out to people, at the end of the day, church is about people, and making these personal connections is really, really key to having people feel welcome when they come to your church. And it might be part of the reason they come back to join you again. And as a real just bonus point, try to remember people's names. It's such a small thing, but it's so fundamental and really makes a difference. I suspect I've shared this before, but our student team used to have a bit of a debrief after Sundays and share who we'd met. And it would help us to make those connections and help us to remember people's names for when they came back. And we definitely had several comments about how that made people feel more welcome when they did actually come back on their next visit.
At the end of the day, though, it's not about thinking kind of commercially about a kind of user experience, but it is about making the best experience for visitors. In an age where the reality is that actually we are competing with a number of other attractions on a Sunday and the rest of the week. And if we don't reduce the stumbling blocks for people, it's just another reason that they can give for not wanting to attend church.
Yeah. So there you go. Hopefully we've walked you through the journey of a newcomer as they take steps through the church. Hopefully that's helpful. If there's things that you think that we've missed or could be helped or added, then do let us know. And we'll be back soon with another episode to talk through more church comms issues.
Gourds and Pomegranates is brought to you by Joe Gallant and Hannah Fleming Hill. You can find episode transcripts and contact the show via gppodcast.uk. www.newcomer.org.uk.